I was reading this article the other day about a tomb in Florence. It was so extravagant and symbolic that it got me thinking at all the stories behind it, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to, unravel it, you know?
It sounds like you're ready for another one of your deep dives. You always find the most interesting stuff, especially when it involves a bit of controversy and maybe some art.
Oh, this one has it all, trust me. We're talking papal power struggles, Medici family drama, amazing Renaissance art, and an anti-pope.
An antipope. Now, that's not something you hear every day. It's like straight out of a Dan Brown novel with secret societies and all of that. This is definitely going to be a good one.
So let's just jump right into it. I'm Hari, your host for this historical adventure.
And I'm Kimi, the expert who's going to try to make sense of all of this.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're in Florence in the early 15th century, a time of huge artistic and political change. And right in the middle of this city is the tomb of a man named Baldassare Cosa, who had the interesting title of Antipope John XXIII.
Yeah, and to really understand this title and the man who had it, we need to understand the complicated religious landscape of the time. Imagine a church that was so divided that there were three different people claiming to be the pope.
Three popes. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. How did this even happen?
Well, it was a period called the Western Schism. It was a time when there were all these conflicting claims to the papacy and a lot of political maneuvering. You see, back in 1378, there was this disputed papal election, and two different popes were elected, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France.
Oh, so there was a papal Game of Thrones way before HBO. But where does our anti-pope John XXIII fit into this?
Well, Baltasar Casa was a cardinal during this time. He was very ambitious and politically astute. As the schism went on, there were a lot of calls to find some sort of solution. So in 1409, a bunch of cardinals got together and held a council in Pisa. Their goal was to fix the conflict and elect a new pope that everyone would recognize.
That sounds like a good idea, but I have a feeling it didn't go as planned.
You're right about that. The Council of Pisa actually made things worse. Instead of ending the schism, they elected another pope, Baldassare Casa, who became John XXIII. Now, you might be thinking, wait, wasn't there already a Pope John XXIII in the 20th century?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. Is there some kind of papal recycling program going on?
Not exactly, but it does get confusing, I know. Just remember, this John XXIII is the one from the 15th century, the anti-pope. And obviously having three popes at the same time caused a lot of problems.
Yeah, I bet it did. So how did Casa, as John XXIII, even manage to hold on to power with two other popes around?
He had some very powerful allies, including the King of France and the King of England. They considered him to be the legitimate pope. That gave him some influence, but things were never really stable. In fact, he actually had to run away from Rome after he was defeated by Ladislas of Naples. He was supporting a different pope.
So this anti-pope was kind of like a hot potato, going from city to city with all kinds of powerful enemies chasing after him. Where did he go after he left Rome?
That's where Florence comes in. Casa went to the Republic of Florence looking for safety. And that's when things get really interesting.
Oh, Florence. The home of the Renaissance, the Medici family. I knew they would be involved somehow. So tell me what happened in Florence.
Well, his arrival in Florence wasn't just a stop on his way out of Rome. It was a move that would really change his life and the future of Florence, too.
Okay, this is where it gets good. I know the Medici family had to be up to something. Tell me all about it.
So Casa gets to Florence in 1413, and by now the Council of Constance is meeting to try and figure out how to finally resolve this whole papal mess.
So another council, another attempt at getting rid of this three-pope problem.
Yeah.
Did they finally figure out who the real pope was this time?
They did. The Council of Constance decided to just get rid of all three popes, including Casa. Then they elected a new pope, Martin V, in 1417. But before all this happened, Casa was in a tough spot in Florence.
Yeah, I mean, being kicked out of the papacy and hiding out in a foreign city probably doesn't feel good. Did the Florentines even want him there?
Well, this is where the Medici family comes in. Giovanni di Bici di Medici, the guy who started the whole Medici dynasty, did something pretty bold. He paid a lot of money to get Casa out of Florence.
But they paid to free a deposed pope? Even for the Medicis, that seems like a risky move. They must have had a good reason for doing that.
You're right, it wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts. Casa had actually done some favors for the Florentines in the past.
Favors is one way to put it. I'm sure those favors involved a lot of politics and probably some money too.
Exactly. A while back, Casa had helped Florence conquer Pisa, a rival city that had been giving them a lot of trouble.
Ah, so they owed him one. Conquering a city is a pretty big favor to cash in.
That's true. And there was another favor that Casa had done for the Medici that was even more important. When he was pope, he made the Medici Bank responsible for all the papal finances. That was a huge deal for the family.
I bet they loved that. Who wouldn't want to be the Pope's banker during the Renaissance? That must have been a pretty good business. So it seems like the Medicis weren't just being nice. They were calling in some favors and making sure they still had some pull in the church.
Exactly. It was a smart move both politically and financially, and it gave the Medici even more power in Florence and strengthened their connection to the papacy. But what about Casa, our deposed antipope? Even though he wasn't pope anymore, he still had some tricks up his sleeve, especially with the Medici on his side.
Okay, this is better than a soap opera.
Yeah.
What happened to Casa after he got out? Did he just disappear?
Oh, Casa was not done yet. Even though he lost his title, he still had some power, especially in Florence. In a move that had to be super awkward, he actually went and submitted to the new Pope Martin V, right there in Florence.
I can't even imagine that. The guy who used to be pope bowing down to the new pope with the Medici behind it all. So did Pope Martin V punish Casa for causing so much trouble? Or did they somehow work things out?
Well, Pope Martin V did something surprising. He actually made Casa a cardinal again.
He got his cardinal hat back. This guy gets kicked out of the papacy, gets ransomed by a powerful family, kisses up to the new pope, and he's still a cardinal. What a wild story.
And just to make things even more interesting, Casa started calling himself the Cardinal of Florence. Pope Martin V probably wasn't thrilled about that. It could have been seen as a challenge to his authority.
Oh, so he was still trying to stir up trouble, even as a cardinal. So what happened next? Did Casa live out his days in Florence, enjoying the good life with the Medici?
Unfortunately for Casa, his time in Florence didn't last very long. He died just a few years later in 1419. But the story doesn't end there. His death is actually the start of a new chapter, a chapter that revolves around his amazing tomb in the Florence baptistry.
Oh, right. The tomb. That's what got us talking about all of this in the first place. We started with his over-the-top tomb. Now we finally gotten to it. But how did an anti-pope end up with such a fancy tomb in such an important place like the Florence baptistry?
That's a good question. It's something that historians and art lovers have been debating for a long time. And it's a question we're going to try to answer in part 2 of our deep dive. Trust me, the story of Casa's tomb is just as interesting as the man himself. It's full of amazing art, political maneuvering, and maybe even a little bit of divine intervention.
So we're back and ready to talk about Casa's death in Florence and the mystery surrounding his extravagant tomb in the Florence baptistry.
It really is fascinating. It makes you wonder how a deposed anti-pope got such a prominent final resting place.
And to make it even more interesting, Casa never actually said he wanted to be buried in the baptistry. It wasn't in his will.
You're right. It makes you wonder if the Medici were behind it all. Remember, they're the ones who paid to get him out of Florence. Maybe they wanted to honor him and keep that connection to the papacy strong, even if it was through a controversial figure.
Yeah, the Medici always knew how to make the best of a bad situation, but getting someone buried in the baptistry wasn't easy. It was a really important religious site. How did they convince the people in charge to do it?
Well, Casa did have one more trick up his sleeve. In his will, he left the baptistry a pretty important relic, the finger of John the Baptist. And not just any finger. It was the finger that they believed pointed to Jesus when he said, "Behold the Lamb of God."
Wow, that is an amazing relic. I can see why the baptistry would be interested in something like that. I bet that made them a lot more willing to bury Casa there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It made the tomb more than just a place to remember a controversial guy. It made it a shrine for a holy relic.
So the tomb becomes a popular place for pilgrims and brings a lot of prestige to Florence. I bet the Medici were thrilled.
They probably were. So let's actually talk about the tomb itself. It's not just historically important, it's a work of art. It fits perfectly into the baptistry, too. It really shows how talented Donatello and Michelozzo were. They were some of the best artists of the early Renaissance.
Donatello and Michelozzo, what a team. I can't wait to hear more about their vision for this monument. What were some of the things they focused on when they designed it?
The design is really interesting because it mixes classical and medieval styles. It was a time when people were becoming really interested in ancient Roman art and architecture again, and you can see that in the tomb. They used Roman-inspired things like the 3 virtues, faith, charity, and hope. Each one has its own little niche, and they're on either side of a sarcophagus with Casa's inscription.
So they were trying to use the grandeur of ancient Rome to make Casa seem more important, even though he was dead. It sounds like every little detail had a meaning behind it.
Exactly. And one detail you can't miss is the gilded bronze statue of Casa on top of the sarcophagus. That was completely new in Italy. It would have been super expensive and difficult to make, which shows how much they wanted to make Casa look important even after he died.
So he might not have been pope anymore, but at least he got a golden statue. Not bad. But let's get back to those virtues. You said they were inspired by ancient Rome, but what else were Donatello and Michelozzo trying to say with them?
Well, putting virtues on tombs wasn't anything new. But the way they're shown here is different. They're very similar to classical Roman sculptures. It's like Donatello and Michelozzo were bringing back the spirit of ancient Rome. But the way they're placed and how big they are makes me think they were trying to shift attention away from Casa himself. Instead, they wanted people to think about the bigger ideas associated with the papacy.
Wait, so they were trying to downplay Casa. I thought these fancy tombs were supposed to make the person buried there look good.
Well, yeah, but remember, Casa was a bit controversial. He was an anti-pope after all. If they made him look too good, it might have upset Pope Martin V, especially after that whole three-pope mess.
Yeah, making the new pope mad probably wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
So they were trying to be careful. They wanted to honor Casa without getting on the pope's bad side. It sounds like they used art to smooth things over.
Exactly. By focusing on the virtues of the papacy instead of Casa's personality, they could sort of suggest that he deserved to be pope without actually saying it. It's like they were quietly trying to make people think well of Casa and his time as pope.
That's pretty clever. It makes you wonder if Casa had any say in the design before he died. But let's talk about something else interesting about the tomb, the inscription. I heard it caused some drama back then. What was so controversial about it?
Well, Pope Martin V, the pope who took Casa's place, wasn't happy about the inscription. He especially didn't like the part that said Casa was still pope when he died. He wanted them to call Casa a Neapolitan cardinal instead. Can you believe that?
Wow, that's awkward. He wanted them to basically rewrite history. I bet the Florentines weren't too happy about that.
Nope, not at all. They stood their ground and said, Quod scripsi, scripsi, which means, what I have written, I have written.
They basically said, nope, we're not changing it. They even put the marzocco, the symbol of Florence, on the tomb. Those lions that are holding up Casa's coffin aren't just there for decoration.
You're right. It's like they were saying, we get to decide how we want to remember our Cardinal of Florence. Thank you very much.
So, is this tomb basically a giant message in favor of Florence and Casa, all wrapped up in a beautiful package?
That's one way to look at it. Some people think it was a subtle jab at Pope Martin V, showing that Florence didn't need to listen to him. Maybe they were even hinting that they wanted a Florentine pope in the future.
A Florentine pope. Bold move. But let's talk about the part of the tomb behind Casa's statue, the Madonna and Child, and that fancy canopy. What were they trying to say with those things?
The Madonna and Child is pretty common on tombs. It represents intercession and divine mercy. It suggests that even though Casa did some questionable things, he's now under the protection of the Virgin Mary.
So even an anti-pope can get a second chance with the Virgin Mary.
Looks like it. And the canopy, some people think it represents the dome of heaven connecting Casa to the divine. Others think it's just a regular canopy symbolizing his status as Cardinal of Florence.
So even the canopy has multiple meanings. This tomb really is full of secrets.
Exactly. That's what makes it so cool. It's more than just a tomb. It's a historical puzzle wrapped in a work of art. Everything about it, from the materials they use to the placement of the figures, seems to have a meaning. Some are obvious and some are hidden.
It's like one of those Where's Waldo pictures. But instead of finding Waldo, you're finding hidden symbols and political messages.
You got it. And the fact that we're still talking about it all these years later shows how amazing Donatello and Michelozzo were. They made a work of art that goes beyond time, making us think and question the complexity of history.
Okay, so we're back and we've talked about the history and the art of this tomb. But I'm curious about, its impact. What do you think is like the lasting legacy of this monument? I mean, it's for a pretty controversial figure after all.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, for one thing, it really shows just how amazing the art of the early Renaissance was. The tomb was really innovative. I mean, the materials, the design, just the size of it, you don't see stuff like that every day.
Yeah. That gilded bronze statue of Casa, that was totally new at the time. And the way Donatello and Michelozzo combined classical and medieval styles, that really influenced a lot of other artists, didn't it? It's like they were setting the stage for some of the greatest funeral monuments ever made.
It is pretty cool how they were inspired by ancient Rome, using those virtues and all those details we talked about. And it definitely caught on. It's like they created a whole new standard for how to make a tomb look grand and impressive.
It's kind of funny though, right? Casa didn't get to be pope, but he was right there when this huge artistic revolution was happening. And his tomb became this amazing example of Renaissance art. But what about Florence itself? Casa and Florence, they had a pretty complicated relationship, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, they worked together and they fought. Remember, he helped them conquer Pisa, and he made sure the Medici Bank got to handle all that papal money. But then he had to run to Florence for protection when he was deposed.
So he was a good ally to have when it was convenient, right?
Yeah.
And the Florentines, especially the Medicis, they were smart. They knew how to take advantage of that.
Yeah, definitely. And it really changed things in Florence, their politics, their economy. It gave the Medici more power, and that connection to the papacy was very important for them. It was definitely a mutually beneficial relationship, even if it was a little bit opportunistic.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And what about that inscription on the tomb, the one that made Pope Martin V so upset? That was a pretty bold move by the Florentines.
It really was. Remember, the Pope asked them to change it, and they just refused. It shows how independent they were. They were becoming more powerful, and they weren't afraid to stand up to the Pope.
They were basically like, we'll do things our way. So this tomb, it's artistic, it's political, and it's even a little bit rebellious. But what about Casa himself? Was he a bad guy? Or was he just a victim of circumstance? It's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? He was definitely ambitious. He knew how to play the game and get what he wanted. But you also have to remember, he lived in a crazy time. It was a very chaotic period for the church.
3 popes at once. Yeah, that's not a good look for the church. I can't imagine how confusing that must have been.
Exactly. I think that's one of the things we can learn from Casa's story and this incredible tomb. History isn't simple, it's messy. And the people we learn about, even someone like an anti-pope, are complicated. They have their own reasons for doing things, their own desires, and their own flaws.
So maybe sometimes the so-called villains of history were just trying to survive in a really crazy world. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the tomb of Antipope John XXIII. We've talked about the history, the art, and what it all means. It's been quite a journey.
I hope everyone enjoyed this deep dive into history with us. We got to uncover some pretty cool things about this era. Remember, history isn't just about names and dates, it's about the lives of real people and all the drama and surprises that come with it.
Maybe one day you'll be in Florence and you'll see this incredible tomb for yourself. And you'll think about Casa and all the things that led to the creation of this monument.
And until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring the stories that have shaped our world.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.